you probably also noticed a lot of discussion about my age. I know I look 40. I keep seeing all those stories about I'm being too old. Let me say something. I was too old. I wasn't too old to create over 15 million new jobs. To make sure 21 million Americans are insured under the Affordable Care Act. Let me ask you think I'm too old to beat Donald Trump?
All right, a very feisty Joe Biden today, just a short while ago in Wisconsin, a crucial battleground state. But the fact of the matter is a lot of folks are thinking he is too old to beat Donald Trump. And obviously that debate performance hasn't helped him, even with party elders who increasingly, we're told, are getting leery of putting him out there and putting him on the ballot. This is something that Lyndon Baines Johnson dealt with in 1968. Who can forget this?
I shall not seek, and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
Very different time period, a very different kind of conditions, but Doris Kearns Goodwin here to say not entirely different. Her book, An Unfinished Love Story, a personal history of the 1960s, regales us with her late great husband, Richard Goodwin, but it does look back at the 1960s, and it does look back at the pressure Lyndon Johnson was under, but he put himself under that pressure to step out of the race at that time. Now you're saying, and others seem to be saying, for the good of the party, maybe the country, Joe Biden should do the same, Doris?
Well, before they do that, what reminded me today in listening to the way Biden responded to the attacks that are being made on him by making fun of it and being able to laugh at it is what FDR did. I mean, in 1944, when he was running for election again, there were all sorts of worries about his health. And the Republicans were arguing that he'd had a stroke, that he'd had a heart attack. So he goes before the Teamsters Union and he says, there's all these attacks on me. I don't mind the attacks on me. I don't mind the attacks on my wife. I don't mind the attacks on my sons. But my dog now has been attacked, Gallup. And the very sensitive dog. And the dog has not been the same dog since. As a result, and then the next few days, he went out among the boroughs of New York in a terribly chilling rain, and he kept smiling in an open convertible. He had bourbon in between all of his talks from one borough to another, and he showed that he was up to it. So the real task right now, before we think about the question of whether the pressures to make Biden withdraw realize him and he just decide to withdraw, can he sustain what we saw this afternoon? Will he accept the decision or the desire on the part of former President Trump to debate him? And what made it work for Ronald Reagan was that the second debate, even though the first one with Mondale did not come out well and suggested that he was having problems with age, only 2 weeks later he was back with a roaring, again, a humorous performance. So maybe by taking this challenge that Biden has been offered by Trump, that he'll allow him before September to quell some of these anxieties. But otherwise, then the question is, as you raised, does he get out of the race, and how does he do it with honor? And I think the way LBJ did it with honor was he said that the war in Vietnam was in a situation right now where he had to concentrate on it day by day. It had to be wound down. He was stopping the bombing. He was going to start talking to the North Vietnamese. He knew that he had to start doing that, and nobody would believe him if he was still a candidate. So he was going to devote every hour of every day to bringing peace to Vietnam. If Biden wanted to withdraw and could talk about the ceasefire that may be being suggested now by Hamas and Israel, he wants to devote all of his times to that. He wants to get the NATO people here and deal with Ukraine. That would be the way he could save honor if he feels that the pressures are such that this doesn't work. If it doesn't work in these next couple of weeks to show the American people that he's really out there again, the master has it. That's what they said about FDR. Then he may have to think, and Lyndon Johnson would offer advice in that regard.
But let me ask you about that, Doris, because I covered the 1944 FDR race. No, I didn't. I just feel that whole. But
we were both there together, don't you remember?
But you know what's so weird about Doris is that at very different examples in 1944 with FDR, and he was getting very, very sick. He would die a little more than a year later. There was also the issue with LBJ and the controversy that the war was really dragging him down. But neither of those presidents' cognitive abilities seem to be in doubt or questioned. A lot of people might not agree with what they were doing and what was going on. At the time with FDR, most Americans didn't even know that he was confined to a wheelchair. But it's very different in Joe Biden's case, because without a prompter, forced to think and on his feet and extemporaneously, he just doesn't have it. And a lot of people were first exposed to that last week. And is that what makes this difference? Is that what makes people wonder? Oh, sure, he's great on a prompter. He's great when he's with a cheering crowd. But he picks and chooses his battles, and that's where the comparison ends.
Well, I think that what people are suggesting to him, and I think it's probably right, is that he has to prove himself now. The debate has created a situation where people have wondered about that. And the only way to do that is to be out there unscripted. He's got to have press conferences. He's got to have interviews. He's got to be out there as much as he can. And he has to now, he's on the defensive. It's not just enough to just say it was just one night. He has to prove that it was just an episode, not a condition that some people have been worrying about. But that's up to him. He is the nominee of the party. It's up to him to make that choice, as he has now, that he's going to continue to run, and he's going to have to prove himself. And that, I don't know how that's going to, I wish I were a historian, I wish I could have a crystal ball and see how it's going to turn out. But only these next days they're going to be important, not just tomorrow, not just the next day, but the next weeks, until he has to decide what he's going to do.
You know, then let me ask you this. I mean, there is a difference, too. At the point he exited the race and said he wouldn't run, you know, New Hampshire just kicked off. He hadn't amassed the delegates you need to be the nominee of the party anyway. In Joe Biden's case, and he intimated at it today, Doris, that he has the delegates, that I'm the guy who has the delegates. I'm paraphrasing here, more or less saying, I think, and I don't want to overread into it, you can't just take this away from me because of one debate and wipe out 3.5 years of performance. Now, that performance, again, is in the eye of the beholder. I get that. But is that a difference? In other words, for LBJ, the reality had to be that, you know, even if he were to get his party's nomination, it would be an uphill battle to win that year, as it is for a lot of parties when they're that divided. In '68 with Democrats, in 1980 with Jimmy Carter fending off Ted Kennedy. You could even go back to '76 with Republicans and Gerald Ford trying to fend off Ronald Reagan. A divided party almost never wins. So would it have changed anything?
I think you're absolutely right, Neil. That was probably the most important line of what he said today, President Biden. I am the nominee of the party.
Right.
And what he's saying to everybody is that it's going to be a fight, because I'm now saying that I'm the nominee. At the time LBJ withdrew from the race, he had been battered by McCarthy in New Hampshire. He was about to lose the Wisconsin primary. And it was true that a president had a lot more power then. You didn't have to have all the primaries, were not enough to make you get the nomination. But if he had gotten it under that enormous pressure, then it really would have been a divided party. You know, as it was, it looked like it almost might have worked for him. I mean, that's what's so sad when I look back on it, because after he made that decision to withdraw from the race, 3 days later, the North Vietnamese said they would come to the bargaining table. Right. And it was the happiest he'd ever been. And then everybody was preparing to go to Hawaii. The Air Force One plane was filled with White House staff and with people from the State Department and the Defense Department. And they were going to go and talk to the generals in Hawaii and start the process. And that was on April 4th. LBJ was supposed to join the plane later that night. And then he receives at 5:30 the word that Martin Luther King had been shot and killed. And then there were riots in the cities, and that took attention away. 2 months later, Robert Kennedy is killed, and then the peace talks stall, and then he goes to the Democratic Convention with Humphrey now as the nominee. And as you remember, of course, we were at least at that. We may not have been in 44, but we were there. And I actually was there, as a matter of fact. And the anti-war protesters were in a confrontation with the police, and while Humphrey is getting the nomination, you know, it's split screen, and Teddy White, the journalist, said the Democratic Party lost the election that night. You're right, and that's what happened with Ford and Carter. That's what happened with Carter and Reagan. So that those kind of divisions in the party really spell trouble. So I think what he's warning people as, it's not going to be so lovely if it's not me, and you go ahead with somebody else, and then there's debate at the convention. Just be aware of that. So that was an important line that may not be missed, and I'm glad you noticed it.
I'm just curious now where this goes, because obviously, I did notice in this debate, Donald Trump and Joe Biden didn't shake each other's hand either before or after. In fact, they don't like each other. That's very obvious. And yet I'm thinking, Doris, of the British election that was quickly concluded today. It's amazing in Britain how when you're heaved out, you leave that day and the new guy moves in. But I want you to react to how both men responded to the outcome. This is from earlier.
Whilst he has been my political opponent, Sir Keir Starmer will shortly become our Prime Minister. In this job, his successes will be all our successes. and I wish him and his family well. Whatever our disagreements in this campaign, he is a decent, public-spirited man who I respect.
I want to thank the outgoing Prime Minister, Rishi Sunak. His achievement as the first British Asian Prime Minister of our country, the extra effort that will have required, should not be underestimated by anyone.
All right, that seems strange, just hearing that, because we don't hear that often. Yet, you know, that used to be the rule more than the exception. I can't see it happening in either case, no matter how this election goes. But again, things can change a lot. What is your sense of the whole attitude that both candidates have toward each other, that both parties and their most loyal followers have, you know, their hands are at each other's throats?
Yeah, you know, something's happened to party in our country. In 1958, there was a poll in which people were asked, suppose your daughter or son married outside the party, would that matter to you? And 72% said no. They were more worried about religion or race at that time. Now, polls show that people are more concerned about their daughter or son marrying outside the party than they are even about religion or race. So I think it's a bad thing that's happened. I mean, I think there's something about that British situation. When I listened to it this morning, I was longing for it back in our country, that an election is over, the other person wishes the other person well, and we move on and we continue to fight. But we fight under boundaries and not hatred and not that sense of just a feeling that we don't even think the other person is real or the other person is human. It's a very scary thing we're at right now. We've got to figure out how to break through that. And I look at Britain, and maybe our own politicians should look at that and say, can't we be a little more like that in today's world?
Yeah. And because, you know, even Herbert Hoover and FDR, no fast friends, and that was a tense car ride over to the Capitol. But, you know, they dealt with each other. So I worry about whether those days are gone. But that's neither here nor there. I wanted to get your sense of what happened in Britain and what could happen in this country. I know that everyone talks about this move to populist governments and to the far right. And yet we saw what happened in Britain with a conservative government toppled after 14 years. We saw what happened in Mexico, where the liberal government, led by and large a liberal government, it was essentially reaffirmed with a new president, you know, following the policies of her backer, the old president. So it's not really that way. There does seem to be, if things aren't going well, to throw the bums out, no matter who's in power. How do you see that playing out?
Well, I think partly what's happened is that there's a lack of trust in government that's developed really ever since the end of the Vietnam War, during Watergate and then during these last decades, so that when the system doesn't seem to be performing for a number of people, then the only answer is throw the bums out. You know, that is what democracy is about. A democracy is a system where the people are allowed to bring the people in or throw them out. But it just shows that maybe governing has become so hard in this modern world, and the whole question of how to deal with the problems have become so great that none of these people are really able to perform in a way that makes people feel, yay, let's go forward with them. And we're seeing all over the world right now the problems of diversity, the problems of immigration, the problems of the gap between the rich and the poor, the problems of globalization and technological changes. All of those have made a lot of people unhappy. And then the instinct is, okay, maybe a new system, and we go from one to the other. And that's not an easy thing to do, to just move wholeheartedly from one to the other and not have that people, that the parties are working together at some point in time to be able to bring solutions to the problems that we have. Real quickly,
Doris, I don't know if the die is cast, but we have at least 3 Democratic representatives who think Joe Biden should step down. There is talk that Virginia Senator Mark Warner, Democrat, will be counseling and meeting with other Democratic senators who are like-minded. I don't know where that is going, just that as Congress returns and talks about all of this stuff, this is the stuff they're talking about. Do you think Joe Biden will make it to the November election as the nominee of the Democratic Party?
No way will I make such a prediction. My historical background tells me that I can look backward in time, and maybe 50 years from now I'll tell you, did he make it or did he not? If we're here in 50 years from now. But there's no way of predicting. It depends on what he does in these days ahead. It depends on whether the pressures increase. It depends on so many things. And it could depend on events that we haven't even known what's going to happen. Look, nobody expected this to happen in the debate this way. Look at the number of October surprises we've had. Now we're going to have July surprises, August surprises, September surprises. There could be wars. There could be so much else. So I'll wait. You and I will talk as an historian when I come back and tell you what happened.
All right, but as I touched on very quickly, Doris, changing horses doesn't change the outcome oftentimes when they do this sort of thing. And I'm just wondering, the signal it sends, it's an uphill battle for Democrats, wouldn't it?
Of course it does, but that can be a good thing. That means there's no complacency, and you got to fight, and you got to do everything in your power to make it work. That's okay. It depends on when that uphill battle is recognized, and better it be recognized early rather than later.
Got it. Doris, you ought to stick to this history thing like I keep telling you. It sounds very promising, so keep at it. Very good seeing you. And history is playing out as we speak. Doris Kearns Goodwin, An Unfinished Love Story, A Personal History of the 1960s. Just a marvelous book that shows you not only that period, but how we got through that period, and probably how we can get through this as well. Stay with us.
Hey, Sean Hannity here. Hey, click here to subscribe to Fox News YouTube page and catch our hottest interviews and most compelling analysis. You will not get it anywhere else.